October 16th, 1939. Scotland enjoys a rare cloudless sky. Sunlight glitters on the waters of the Firth of Forth as a train clatters across its towering bridge. Passengers lean to the windows, watching the warships anchored below. Then dark shapes dart over them, faster and larger than anything the people on board have ever seen. They dive sharply as their bomb bay doors groan open. A geyser of water erupts beside the bridge as the first bomb explodes, shockwaves rippling across the estuary and shaking the vessels at anchor. Panic grips the train, yet the conductor pushes forward, praying the next strike won't hit the tracks before they reach the other side. Another blast tears the air. The Luftwaffe have arrived, looking to end the Battle of Britain before it even begins. In April 1937, over the skies of the small Basque town of Guernica in Spain, civilians begin to look above their heads as the hum of engines grow louder. Something was approaching fast. The silhouettes of dozens of aircraft grew larger, closing in without any sign of slowing down. Bombs and bullets tore through streets and squares. Entire blocks crumbled under the barrage. By the time the raiders turned back, as many as 1,654 lives had been lost. The Spanish nationalists quickly sought to blame the atrocity on the Republican enemies, but as officials inspected the ruins, the real culprit emerged. Among the debris lay shattered bomb casings, each marked with the German Imperial Eagle. Just a year earlier, the Condor Legion, a detachment of Hitler's young aerial forces, had arrived in Spain to aid Francisco Franco's forces. For months, the country had served as their personal testing ground. Pilots and engineers experimented with new tactics, refining dive bombing techniques and implementing aircraft modifications to make their machines more lethal with every sortie. For Hitler, Guernica was not just about supporting an ally. It was a rehearsal. The lessons learned there would soon be unleashed on a far larger stage, this time set not to collapse a single town, but an entire nation. That day arrived on September 1st, 1939, when Wehrmacht columns surged across Poland's borders, spearheaded by swarms of Luftwaffe aircraft. World War II had officially begun. Once again, bombers descended on civilian towns, but this time there were not dozens, there were thousands. Payloads rained down across cities, railways, and communication hubs, leaving whole regions in ruins and paralyzing Poland's ability to resist. Polish pilots scrambled to meet them, but no matter how many Polish aircraft rose up to meet the fighters above, few could manage to make it back to the ground in one piece. For bombing runs, the Germans relied on the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, infamous for its precision dive bombing and nerve-wracking sirens designed to sow fear in its enemies. Some variants of these bombers could even stabilize themselves when pilots blacked out under crushing G-forces, making it one of the most formidable tools for rapid aerial dominance. The Luftwaffe technology was so advanced that by the second week of the invasion, Poland's air force had been decimated, losing more than 300 aircraft. The collapse of Poland's skies was quickly matched by the collapse on the ground, and on October 6, 1939, barely a month after the campaign began, Poland was defeated. Hitler's Luftwaffe had proven its might beyond question, and with Poland conquered, his gaze shifted northward, toward Denmark and Norway, where yet more soldiers and civilians would feel the shadow of his aerial war machine. Across the English Channel, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain spoke to the nation over a public radio broadcast, stating, quote, "Hitler's action shows convincingly that there is no chance of expecting that this man will ever give up his practice of using force to gain his will. He can only be stopped by force. We in France are today in fulfillment of our obligations, going to the aid of Poland." Immediately, the Royal Navy was ordered to impose a naval blockade of Germany, just as it had done more than 20 years earlier in World War I. However, even as ships were put to sea to counter the Nazis, British planners still held to the hope that the campaign against Hitler could be driven primarily by bomber groups that could push past Luftwaffe fighters, cross the English Channel, and rain destruction on German targets, forcing the Führer to capitulate before the conflict expanded. In the first months of the war, however, both sides were still constrained by political limits. Fearing massive retaliation and the loss of potential Allies' support, Britain left German cities off the target list to avoid civilian casualties, focusing instead on Kriegsmarine warships across naval ports. Shortly after the campaign began, RAF flying officer Andrew McPherson climbed into the cockpit of his Bristol Blenheim medium bomber. It wasn't the fastest or most advanced aircraft in service, but it could still carry a respectable payload, and with the right pilot on board, it could send a German warship to the bottom of the ocean. And that day, McPherson was determined to do just that. Dispatched on a reconnaissance sweep over the North Sea, McPherson suddenly spotted a formation of vessels sailing near Wilhelmshaven. No anti-aircraft fire reached up to meet him. Either the ships were unprepared, or they hadn't seen him yet. Whatever the case was, McPherson knew he had to act fast, but protocol was clear, and before releasing any ordnance, he had to first radio back to base for authorization. He called in the sighting, yet only heard static coming from the other side. He tried again. Once again, nothing. RAF communications were not reliable in the early days of the war, and it was not uncommon for a pilot to have to make it all the way back to base just to report what he'd seen. McPherson left the German ships behind to steam on, unable to drop a single bomb. Back at base, he was out of the Blenheim the moment the wheels touched down on the runway, racing to deliver his report. There was no more time to waste. 15 Handley Page Hamptons and 9 Vickers Wellingtons were scrambled and dispatched toward the contact. But by the time the bombers finally arrived over the target area, the German vessels were gone. Just one day after the failed bombing run, the scene repeated itself when Flying Officer Andrew McPherson again spotted German warships moving in the same waters as the day before. Once again, McPherson realized in frustration that his radio could not reach back to base, forcing him to return before his report could reach command. This time, however, the British had more luck. Though not all aircraft located the enemy, one group finally made contact with the battleships Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, and Admiral Scheer. But finding the target was just half the mission. At the time, British crews were critically unprepared for real combat runs. It's reported that during that particular operation, some pilots nearly left base without bombs at all, and as one squadron leader ordered his gunners to test their weapons mid-flight, he quickly discovered every gun was faulty. They were off to fight Nazis without a single bullet. Another squadron had to be scrambled to ensure the attack could go ahead. When the moment to fight finally came, the results were far from what the British had hoped for. 3 bombs struck Admiral Scheer, but none detonated. The only serious damage came when a Blenheim accidentally crashed into the light cruiser Emden, taking 11 sailors and injuring 30. It didn't take long before German flak and interceptors began to tear into the formation, claiming the first RAF victims of the war. In the chaos, one Wellington became separated from its squadron and drifted off course over enemy territory. Below, the crew spotted a coastal town. Unwilling to return home without striking a blow, they dropped their bombs, only to discover later that the German target had in fact been the Danish town of Esbjerg. The explosions ripped through an apartment building, wounding civilians and claiming one's life. It was by every measure one of the RAF's most disastrous early campaigns. With no real victories to claim, Britain had gained nothing to pressure Hitler to the negotiating table. Worse still, the British knew that soon it would be Germany's turn to strike back. Even if RAF bombing runs were not yet the most advanced in Europe, the British trusted that their defensive network was strong enough to keep German attackers at bay until their battle tactics could be refined. Almost the entire length of Britain's east coast was protected by a layer of battleships in constant rotation. RAF bases strung along the shoreline, and most importantly, radar stations that scanned the skies day and night. These chain home systems provided vital data: the size of enemy formations, their altitude, their speed, and their direction. With that data, RAF squadrons could be scrambled in minutes, climbing to intercept before enemy bombers ever reached their targets. One of the most crucial of these stations had just been established a few months earlier at Drone Hill, Scotland. From here, warnings were relayed across the region to multiple RAF bases. This was critical for national defense, as the area was considered particularly vulnerable, lying within range of northern Germany, and guarding one of Britain's most important naval installations, the Rosyth base, stationed at the river, cutting across the Firth of Forth, where capital ships often came for repair. For the Luftwaffe, this was an inviting target. For the RAF, it was an area constantly on edge, eyes glued to radar screens, waiting for the first sign of an intrusion. Through the first weeks of the war, the coast remained quiet. But on October 16, 1939, when the skies over Scotland were bright and clear, Drone Hill's radio operators suddenly caught what they'd been dreading. A formation of unidentified aircraft was heading straight toward them. Shortly after radar stations flagged the intruders, Civilian volunteers of the Royal Observer Corps made visual contact with them. The enemy rode the cloud deck for cover, making the shapes of their aircraft hard to read. However, with every second counting, there was no time to wait and find out what exactly they were up against. Flight Lieutenant George Pinkerton was ordered to assemble a group and get airborne. He and 2 other pilots vaulted into the cockpits of their new Supermarine Spitfires, some of Britain's finest interceptors, known by their knife-edge maneuverability and a Merlin engine that could drive them to roughly 370 miles per hour. Minutes after wheels up, new reports started to come in. Lookouts on the anchored cruiser HMS Edinburgh had eyes on the intruders overhead. This time, they were low enough to make out the greenhouse-like stepless nose glazing, a hallmark feature of the Henkel HE-111 bomber. At the time, the HE-111 was among Germany's most produced bombers and a crucial piece for the Luftwaffe's early bombing campaigns. Packing internal vertical racks and external hardpoints, they could sling everything from standard bombs to heavy external loads designed to erase key targets in a single run. It made sense that this would be the type chosen by the German Aerial Command to spearhead the first strike over British airspace. They launched from the German island of Sylt off Denmark, close enough for a rapid dash in and a clean escape before the RAF had time to mount an efficient defense. Pinkerton and his men dropped toward the reported position. Luck favored them. The bomber was still there, either oblivious to the observers below, relaying its coordinates, or circling for one last look before committing to its run. Pinkerton instructed his men to get into attack formation. They were driving head-on. Tracer rounds stitched the air past the German bombers, but no vital hits landed. Rather than trade fire, the HE-111s knifed into a sharp turn and clawed for cover, set on disappearing into the clouds. Pinkerton pushed the throttle, his Spitfire darting after them, cannon shattering, round after round, but still no luck. In the blink of an eye, the clouds swallowed the bombers. Pinkerton's wingmen kept firing blindly, but the sky gave nothing in return. The enemy was gone. For hours, Spitfires combed the sector, hunting for any Luftwaffe stragglers without success. As the morning drew to a close, the pilots returned to base. They hadn't brought the Germans down, but they had driven them off. Britain, it seemed, had bought some time before the first German bombs fell. Around noon, the chain-home radar began to glow with warnings once again. Inbound contacts. On the ground, Pinkerton and his men barely had any time to refuel their tanks and rearm their guns before command called for another scramble to intercept the incoming formation. The first eyes on came from the Royal Observer Corps. The moment they saw the attackers, they understood what the German plan had been all along. The HE-111s Pinkerton had tangled with earlier were merely spies. Their bomb bays were packed with cameras instead of payloads, deployed to map the estuary and its defenses, reporting back all information to the aircraft that would actually carry out the offensive action, the brand new Junkers Ju-88A1. Formally introduced to Luftwaffe units only months earlier, the Ju-88A was unlike most bombers at the time. Built with speed as its guiding principle, it was one of the first Schnellbomber, or fast bombers, to take off German runways. It combined a modular fuselage, strong wings, and spacious bays into a design that could serve as a medium bomber, a steep-angle attacker, a torpedo carrier, a heavy fighter, and, as Germany's technology upgraded, also one of the Luftwaffe's most effective radar-equipped night interceptors. But on that day, it had one single role: the ultimate destroyer of British targets. Thanks to the HE-111's previous reconnaissance mission, the Ju-88 had learned that, anchored amid other vessels in the Firth of Forth, was the formidable HMS Hood, the lone battlecruiser of her class, which at 860 feet had stood for years as one of the largest warships on the planet. German air crews had tried and failed to sink her before. Now, with defenses thin and RAF squadrons scrambling to intercept the aerial attack, they sensed a narrow window to finish the job. 3 HE-111s would join the raid, but the brunt of the operation would fall to 4 attack waves led by Commanding Officer Helmut Pohle, each a trio of Ju-88s, every bomber carrying 2 1,100-pound bombs. Their flight path would land them right above where Hood and her sister vessel lay. Once they reached them, the Germans would strike fast, put Britain's naval pride underwater, then vanish into clouds before the RAF could arrive to avenge them. Although numerous anti-aircraft batteries were positioned along the shoreline, at the time, British defense still lacked the precise fire control needed to maximize ground-to-air strike efficiency, and hundreds of rounds might have to be fired before a single bomber was touched. The real weight of the defense would rest with Pinkerton and his fellow pilots, armed with nothing more than a set of guns and a fiery resolve to defend their homeland from the Nazis. As the Germans closed in on their target, Commanding Officer Helmut Pohle could make out the silhouettes of British warships below. The skies were perfect for an attack, and no British fighters had yet arrived. The moment to strike had come. Pohle pushed his Ju-88 into a steep dive, eyes scanning the river for HMS Hood. But the legendary battlecruiser was nowhere to be found. There was no way the British could have moved her so quickly. In fact, Hood was out at sea. The HU-111 scouts had misidentified her for another massive silhouette floating in the area, the renowned-class battlecruiser HMS Repulse. Though not as iconic as Hood, Repulse's hull still stretched 750 feet and carried the firepower to trade blows with some of Germany's best. Striking her would not have been a small feat. There was a problem for Pohle and his men, though. Repulse lay too close to port. In the opening months of the war, Hitler had forbidden raids that risked heavy civilian casualties, fearing such strikes might backfire before he consolidated his grip on Europe. Pohle could not risk disobeying his Führer. The pilots had only moments to rethink the raid. His primary target was out of reach, but other British ships rode at anchor, far enough from the docks to be fair game. His eyes were fixed on HMS Southampton, a newly commissioned light cruiser. Not the most powerful ship in the Royal Navy, but its loss would surely still sting. Pohle nosed his bomber down into a violent dive. The descent was so steep that the canopy began to crack, and one of his machine guns broke down. He ignored it, his entire focus narrowed to the cruiser below. Once he reached 1,800 feet, he opened the bomb bay. As the payload fell, one bomb slammed into Southampton's deck, ripping through 3 levels of steel. For a heartbeat, Pohle thought he had her, only to watch in disbelief as the bomb tore out the far side of the hull and exploded in the water. The damage to the vessel was minimal. Pohle could not believe how his luck had betrayed him, but not all hope was lost yet, as the attack was not over. A second wave of Ju-88s closed in, this one led by Oberlieutenant Hans Storp. Without wasting a second, the pilots lined up on Southampton and the cluster of warships around her. Bomb bay doors yawned open, payloads tumbled down, their pads seemingly pointed straight to the vessels below. However, one after another, the explosions missed, landing dangerously close to the vessels and the nearby railway bridge supporting trains with civilian passengers, but resulting in no more than bursts of spray erupting around the British ships. There was no time to linger. British defenses were surely closing in. The moment their bombs were spent, the Ju-88s banked south, racing for the open sea. But their escape was cut short because the moment they leveled out, shapes appeared ahead. A pack of British Spitfires, guns already pointing toward them. The Germans had just dropped the first bombs on British soil. Now, they would pay for it. RAF pilots broke into action, swarming Oberlieutenant Hans Storp's formation and going after the Ju-88s one by one. 2 of the German bombers managed to weave through the incoming gunfire, clawing their way toward the North Sea, where they'd be finally safe from the Spitfire's line of range. Storp tried to follow, but the British fighters clung to his tail and refused to let go. Storp could only keep on dodging close fire for so long, and before he could make it out of the British islands, a burst ripped into the fuselage, claiming one of his gunners on the spot. The Oberlieutenant fought the controls, jerking his bomber out of the line of fire, but the shells were coming from every direction, and soon enough, another shell slammed into one of his engines. The entire Ju-88 trembled as the explosion tore through critical systems. Speed began to drain away, the controls becoming more erratic by the second. Storp understood the gravity of the situation, and he let his men know they weren't going to make it back to Germany. Still, the crew had one final duty. Their Ju-88 carried technology too new and secret to be captured by the British. If the bomber was going to collapse, there was just one option: to line it up for a fatal plunge into the river below, where the enemy could never retrieve it. As the bomber began its final descent, the British fighters trailing behind never stopped firing, their cannons hammering the Ju-88 until the moment it struck the water. Storp and the surviving crew barely had time to break free of the wreck before it sank, only to find a fishing boat waiting nearby, ready to arrest them. They were taken prisoner, soon bound for Canada, where they would spend the rest of the war behind barbed wire. It was not the end they'd envisioned, but unlike many captured later, particularly in the east, they would at least survive. Watching the mission crumbling before his very eyes, Commanding Officer Helmut Pohle, who had lingered near the Firth of Forth to oversee the attack, decided to retreat before he and his men ended up like Storp. The fastest way out was a direct course across the estuary. However, the return home would not be easy, as Lieutenant George Pinkerton was already waiting for him, hunting for any stragglers. The moment Pinkerton spotted German bombers above his Spitfires, he pulled his fighter into a climb, determined to close the gap before the Germans could vanish into the gathering clouds. The Ju-88s were flying 3 miles above him, engines straining, desperate to break free. But the British were not giving up, pushing their own machines to the limit, guns armed and ready to go. Suddenly, a movement on his flank caught Pinkerton's eye. There were more aircraft. His heart jumped, fearing that another German wave was already here. However, as they drew closer, he realized they were no threat, just a group of local trainees, oblivious to the battle raging above. By the time Pinkerton refocused on the Germans, they were gone. He refused to let it end there. Earlier that day, a Hinkel had slipped from his grasp. He would not let a Ju-88 do the same. Pinkerton climbed higher, eyes scanning the cloud banks, searching for any sign of them. Suddenly, a shout from his gunner, a shadow moving across the haze. Pinkerton dove on the target, guns blazing, until the unmistakable sound of bullets striking metal confirmed he had found his target. The Ju-88 began its uncontrollable descent, smoke coming out of both engines. On Portobello Beach below, a young boy named Richard DeMarco was playing with his brother when the shadow of the doomed aircraft passed them overhead. Decades later, he would remember, quote, "The noise of the engines was deafening, and so was the rat-tat-tat of the Spitfire. The left-hand side engine was on fire. It looked like a dragon coming toward me." Moments later, the Ju-88 slammed into the sea. Of its crew, only Helmut Pohle survived. The enemy had been defeated, and back at the mouth of the Firth of Forth, sailors aboard anchored vessels could finally get a moment to breathe. On the deck of HMS Mohawk, Captain Commander Richard Frank Jolly could return to overseeing the preparations to raise anchor and head for the port of Rosyth. But just as the men allowed themselves to loosen their guard, the low hum of engines filled the air once again. No sirens had sounded. Surely this had to be a friendly aircraft. Jolly glanced skyward and froze. Painted across the tails of the incoming bombers was the black swastika. The attack wasn't over. 2 more waves of Ju-88s had slipped through and bore down on the British fleet once again, determined to finish what Pohle and Storp had failed to achieve. The first bomber dove so fast, the crew of Mohawk barely had time to swing their anti-aircraft guns skyward. Tracers clawed at the incoming German, but before they could neutralize the incoming threat, the Ju-88 released its payload. Both bombs missed, splashing just next to the destroyer. Yet the near misses were devastating. The concussion blasted columns of water and shrapnel skyward, crashing down on deck with lethal force. 15 sailors were taken out instantly. 30 more were wounded. Among the injured was Captain Jolly himself. Gravely hurt, he refused medical evacuation, choosing instead to stay on deck, directing damage control and rallying his men until he could stand no longer. He lost his life before he could be carried from his ship. Above, fresh squadrons of Spitfires scrambled to intercept the raiders. They failed to bring down a single Ju-88, but their fire was enough to scatter the Germans, forcing them to retreat before landing a decisive blow. By 6 p.m., the skies finally fell silent. The first aerial clash between Germany and Britain in the Second World War was over. Despite the toll on the Royal Navy, the RAF claimed the day as a success. However, the Luftwaffe would not give up so easily. Soon, they would return with greater numbers and fewer restraints, and by the summer of 1940, the skies over Britain would ignite in the full fury of the Battle of Britain, where no target, military or civilian, would be safe from the wrath of the German bombers.